Hey there, YouTube family. Welcome back to a brand new hour-long painting lesson. Today, we're going to be working on a sunflower at sunset. And this is something I'm actually really excited to paint. I'm doing so today because it was voted for over on the Patreon polls. The winner was the underwater seascape, which we did, but the runner-up by far was actually this one. So I'm happy to do this one here today. I've, to be honest with you, been in a very a mood where I want to paint a lot of flowers. And as you know, I've just released the new Painting Prompts flower book over on Patreon, which was 21 reference photos and 21 traceables of flowers for those uninspired days. And I did that, and I wanted to continue. I wanted to make more. So this is what we are happily working on here today. As per usual, I'm going to quickly go over the materials before we begin, but I encourage you to watch this process even if you are used to these videos, because we're going to do things a little bit differently here today, and the materials will affect that. So let's begin by noting that there is a canvas. It is 9 by 12 inches. The drawing is already done on here, and it was done with these woodless colored pencils as per usual. I like these because they allow me to allocate different colors to different subjects. So the sunflower is in an orange, the stem is in a green. They're also semi-erasable, which is great. For those of you who are looking at this and you say, I don't really want to draw all of those petals or kind of the leaves in these different positions, don't you worry. I did add the traceable and the reference photo up over on Patreon. You can actually see the reference photo right here. We'll be working quite deeply with that here today. But for those of you who are new or unaware, Patreon is a great way to support the channel, to say thank you, but it's also a great way to get plenty of extra bonus rewards. Up there right now, I have over 50 bonus hour-long lessons just like this. You can also get access to our exclusive Facebook page where we all share work, give each other critiques, help each other out. You can vote in the polls, you get the traceables and the reference photos for the new lessons, and I did just add up that new ebook of 21 traceables and reference photos of flowers, so you can go check all of that out in the description. But with that said, let's get back to talking about what we're using here today. So to continue, I actually do have the reference photo. It is printed out here. I'm going to use this because today I'm going to mix my colors here on my palette. I'm going to test them on the reference photo, and then I'm going to work them onto the canvas. That way I know I have essentially exactly the right color. It's a really great way to paint with yellows because they're such delicate colors and it's easy to skew them too much in one way or another. So actually working directly with a reference photo can be really useful. On top of that, I have my small dish of water. This is to clean my brushes, take off that excess pigment, and do all of that. Here I have a painting cloth. I like this to wipe off my excess water and my excess paint as well. Here I have my palette, and in regards to colors, you don't need all of these colors. All you really need is a yellow, a red, a brown, a blue, a black, and a white. However, I have a couple extra colors here. I have a titanium white, a primary yellow, a cadmium yellow deep hue, primary red burnt sienna, a burnt umber, a primary blue, and a Mars black. I have a couple yellows, that way I have a warmer and a cooler option. I have a couple of browns, so I have a warmer and cooler option. But aside from that, we're essentially just using the primary colors. From there, let's talk about brushes. As per usual, I'm going to be using my large flat-headed brush. It is 2 centimeters wide. I like it because it can hold a lot of paint, and it has this nice sharp edge for sharper subjects like what we have in the foreground. Then I have a medium-sized flat-headed brush. This one is only 1 centimeter wide. It's great when we get into a little bit more of a detailed area. Then I have a smaller flat-headed brush. It is 0.5 centimeter wide, so it's great for the really detailed, really finite areas. I also use the corner of it for extremely delicate applications. We'll be using that a lot in the middle of the sunflower right here. Then I move on to a different brush, and this is the round-headed brush. As you can see, it doesn't actually have any sharp edges, and I like this a lot for softer blends, so areas like this in the background that don't actually have any hard edges. From there, I have a smaller round-headed brush. I don't know that I'll be using this, but I like to keep it on hand, and it's just essentially for the detailed blends in the background. So that is essentially all of the materials we'll be working with here today. Now, let's have some fun and jump into it. So we're going to begin here today with the larger flat-headed brush because we're going to start by painting the background. Now I'm going to take this and I'm going to dip just the tip of it in some water here and make it nice and damp. I'm wiping off the excess on the dish and I'm not trying to get the water high up on the brush. I only really want it to maybe that third to halfway point. I don't want it up here where the glue is holding all of the bristles together. Then I'm wiping off the excess water, and I'm doing this so that it condenses my bristles. It'll kind of taper them all in, keep them together, but it'll also extend a little bit of water into my paint, which will extend how long it's wet for and help me blend larger areas for a longer period of time. Now I'm going to start by taking some titanium white and I'm going to move this to a clean area on my palette. Then I'm going to want to start by mixing this area up here. So I'm going to take a little bit of yellow just to the corner of my brush so that way I don't dilute the entirety of it. And I'm going to move that into my mixture here. And I'm going to blend it out quite evenly. I don't want one part of the brush to be more yellow than white than yellow. I want it relatively consistent. Then I'm going to take this pigment, I'm just going to test it up here in my reference photo and see how close it is. And as you can see, it really isn't that close at all. This is much more pink. So I'm going to take a hint of primary red, and I do mean just a hint because it's quite a saturated pigment, and I'll work that in there. So I'll just take that, work it in, and now we'll try this. And it's closer, it's a little bit more warm, but this is a bit darker than the pigment we're currently working with. So I'm going to darken it, and I'm going to darken it with some burnt umber instead of Mars Black. And I'm doing that because Mars Black and yellow typically mix and blend to make much more of a green. And I don't want it to turn into a green, I want it to stay warm. So I'm using a darker pigment, which is the burnt umber. It's a little bit more earthy, but this will help me get that color a little bit better. And that is quite close. I think I just need a hint more red. There we go. And it doesn't need to be absolutely perfect, but you can tell by using the reference photo and by going back and forth like this, we have such a much more interesting color than we would have had if we just used the yellow and the white like I tried initially. It's actually a much more complex, interesting pigment, and going back and forth is helping us learn to blend. So that's quite close. I like that a lot. I'm going to take it and I'm going to start applying it up here in the top corner, and then I'm going to blend it around the edge, and then I'll bring it in a little bit as well. Yeah, you can tell just how much more complex this is, and it looks really pretty. It definitely paid off the extra effort. Now I'll take a little bit more of it and I'll start to thicken the applications that I had, because when you start to drag it out you thin the paint more and more, and we don't want that to happen. So I'm just going back and I'm adding a little bit more pigment, and I'm stopping as I get relatively close here to the flower. Then we need to create a softer color, a brighter color for around the flower, because here you can see that it just gets progressively more bright. I'm going to try the easy way, and that's just going to be taking a lot of titanium white and mixing it right into / beside the pigment we just used. This will set the white to be a little bit warmer. It'll give it a little bit of that red, earthy yellow color that we had, and I'll test it. And that actually looks quite close. It's a little bit more creamy than the white that we have on here, but I think this is actually a pure white. So I'm okay if it gets a little bit of extra pigment. We can always go back in and brighten it, but I like this a lot. I think it's close. It's definitely a brighter value than what we were working with. It will help create depth. And for those of you who are unaware, who are kind of new to painting, you can create depth in painting by wrapping light around a subject, and that includes the sky. So we kind of have the sun right back here, maybe behind the sunflower, and as you move farther away from the sun in all directions, it's going to get slightly darker in the sky, and that's going to create a gradient, which is going to show depth. So it's important to note that these gradients and depth don't just exist in your subjects, they also exist in the sky and everything that the light affects. which is truly everything. So I worked this around the edges of my petals here. As you can see, I'm using the sharper edges of my brush to do so. And then as I get towards this edge here, I'm going to start blending them. So I'll do that like this. It's very soft. The softer you apply your paint, the softer you hold your brush, the more of a delicate application you're going to get. And the harder you press, the more you're going to drag paint and create a streaky, stroke-like appearance. Which isn't a bad thing. It can be a really nice stylistic choice, but if you want a smooth blend, try creating much more soft applications. There we go. I'm bringing the warmth in a little bit more than the reference photo just because I want it to feel a little bit warmer. There we go. But I definitely like the color the reference photo gave me for right up there. I think that's really, really nice. Good. So that's a solid start to our painting. Now let's continue it over here on the right hand side because this essentially has the same thing happening. Now I left a good bit of my initial mixture untainted by the titanium white, that way I could use it again later to mix more, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. So I'm going to take some titanium white, some of my primary yellow, mix those two together. I'm going to follow a pretty similar approach to what I was doing before to remix this. So I start with my yellow and my white, then I know that it needs to be more red, so I'll grab some of that primary red. This will give it more of a pinkish orange look to it. There we go. And now we need to darken it, so I'll grab some burnt umber. We're definitely getting closer. Still has a bit of yellow there unblended, so I'm just trying to work that through. And then we need to make it significantly brighter, so I'll take a lot of titanium white and I'll mix that in. And as you can see, it's now incredibly close to the color we initially had, just needs a little bit more pink. A little bit more red, a little bit more orange. There we go. And I'll take this and I'll start applying this up into the corner here. You can see it's a little bit more rosy, but I can tell this is a little bit more rosy. And I'm just going to apply this along that edge as we do. I'm going to work it around this blurred background, like so. And I'll drag it down a little bit. Can connect it along the top, but then I'm going to stop because I really don't want to bring it too far in there. We do want the titanium white. So now, because we're moving to a titanium white mixture, I don't want to mix too much of this very saturated pigment into it, so I'm just taking that extra pigment off my brush here, wiping it off on the edges, and then I'll wipe the excess off on my mat there. Now we'll go back to this pigment, this very bright pigment, and yet again I'm going to work it along the borders of my petals. I like to start here because the pigment that we have on our brush is most easily workable with when it's quite damp and new, when we have the most amount of paint on there and when it has the most amount of water mixed in with it. It's going to give us those very smooth applications, and as we continue to make these strokes, it's going to progressively get less and less so because we're simply using up all of that watery mixture. Now here I'm grabbing hints of the pigment that we used over here. I'm moving that in with the titanium white, remixing it because we didn't quite have enough, which isn't a bad thing. I like to go back and remix my paints just because it makes me better at mixing paints. And then as I get towards the outskirts here, I'm going to now start blending into the rest like we did initially. So here, just moving it out, moving this color into this, moving this into this, creating this very soft, warm look. That is quite nice. Now, as you can see, it's much brighter over here on the reference photo, but I want it to be a little bit more dramatic on my painting because this looks a little diffused, it looks a little too bright, and I don't want it to be to that extent. But I can tell that there's a middle ground between the two that I want, so I'm going to take a bit more of that highlight and I'll just work it even farther, like so. That's what's so great about having a reference photo. We can mix these colors exactly if we want, we can change things slightly if we want, and it gives us a reference of what realism looks like, and then we get to make it as stylized as we want, or change the time of day or the setting or the colors a little bit. But it lets us know that we're not just taking the easy road. I actually did this painting once before and I didn't end up loving it. I felt like it was a little bit too simple, and that's why I decided to use the reference photo for this version to make sure that I was holding myself accountable to using much more interesting palettes and colors. So now I'm going to just continue to fill in this brighter area down here. Again, there's a lot of space, but I'm not going to begin with that. I'm going to begin along the outskirts of my petals. I'm occasionally going over them, but that's okay. I'm going to go back in and repaint a lot of that anyway when I do the petals, as the petals will overlap. And that's one of the big reasons why we paint the backgrounds to begin with. It's so we can warm up, get those motor skills really firing. Sometimes when we take a week or two off, we can kind of lose the motions, the brush strokes, the blends, and we get it back fairly quickly. All it really takes is 10-20 minutes, but by starting in the background in something you can be a little bit more loose in, it's a great way to just get those skills back without hindering your main subjects, and to practice before you get into them. It's also great because generally we layer our foreground on top of our background, so I'm going to go back in and I'm going to be painting all of these petals on top of the background, so it doesn't really matter how messy the background is because something's going to be layered on top of it. Wherein if we started with the foreground and then we tried to paint meticulously around all of those finished petals when we're doing the background second, it'd be a very arduous process, and we don't really want that. And it can be so much more easily achieved in this layering process. So here now I'm working in slightly more detailed, confined areas. If you find this a little bit too difficult with this large brush, then I urge you to switch to the medium-sized or smaller flat-headed brush. Both will work and both will work quite well. I'm just using this because I am fairly well practiced with a brush of this size, and I have a good idea of where I want everything as is. Now I'm starting to run out of paint, and I could definitely stretch this out to here. I could stretch these to where I want, but if I did that, I'd be making the pigment much more thin and I might have to do extra layers. So instead, I'm just going to mix a little bit more of this pigment right here, and then continue. I am not a fan at all of stretching pigment, of taking pigment from one area, moving it to another, and then making an area slightly thin so that I get to fill it up so that I don't have to go back and mix. You'll become a much, much stronger painter much more quickly if you go back and remix your paints and you keep your layers a little bit more pronounced and thick. Going back and remixing them is a great, great habit to get in. That way you retain how you're making your mixes, and the next time you want to mix that color, you have a good idea of how to do it. It's great practice. So that is what I'm going to do for the background, I think. Now I'm going to do something I do in a lot of these. I'm going to take 5 or 6 steps back and look at the painting from an afar. And I do this so that I get a good representation of how that gradient's moving, if it's too dramatic in one area or another, and how all of that kind of balances itself. And it's very subtle, which I like. This area is a little bit more pronounced, which I don't think is a bad thing because it is meant to be a bit of a vignette, draw the viewer's eye in. The eye go to the innately most bright area of a piece, which is here, because this is a bit darker, so the eye won't kind of run off the painting. But we can tone it down a little bit. As noted, we did go with something that was quite a bit more stark than that, so I can mix up a little bit here, and this is actually good because it started to dry a little bit, but because our brush is damp, it kept the paint wet longer, and now I can move this on quite simply. It's blending wet into wet in some areas, but in others, I'm kind of just moving on top of the paint that we had before with a semi-transparent layer because, again, the pigment's semi-wet and watery, which allows me to work on top of it rather than blending into it, and it allows us to get these soft, clean blends that we have. So we just brightened that up a little bit. We desaturated it a little bit. When you add white to a pigment, it does tend to desaturate it, takes out that vibrancy. Taking a step back, and now they look much more close. This still is a little bit darker, which I do like because there is more negative space here than there is over here, and I think it helps it in that way. But with that, let's continue our painting by first cleaning this brush relatively well. We're done with it for now, and I don't want any paint drying in it, rendering it stiff later. So I add a lot of water, I wipe it off. It isn't perfectly clean, and I will take a break in this painting to go clean it really well. Brush care is important if you want to keep them, but that should sustain it for half an hour to 45 minutes. So with that, I'm now switching to the medium-sized round-headed brush. And again, I like this because it creates very soft edges, which we're going to start creating along our sides here. And just so you are aware, just prefacing this before we go into it, when we paint these two abstract shapes here, they're trees, they're bushes, but because they're farther away, we don't see the detail, and that way we really see the detail in the sunflower. They kind of balance each other well. When you just look at this void of the sunflower, it looks like a really odd shape. You don't really get an idea of what it is with the background. Same goes for this one on the other side. So as we do this and we don't have our sunflower, this is going to look like an odd painting. It's meant to, it is part of the process. We need to brace ourselves for that because something a lot of beginners do, they'll start working on their painting. Halfway through, they'll say, you know what, this doesn't look great. They'll quit, they won't go back to it. But recognizing that different portions of the painting aren't meant to look perfect until the entirety of the painting is painted is a big step in it. So don't get discouraged when this looks a little strange, as it will naturally look strange because we won't have a sharp subject or a main focus area in the painting. So keep that all in mind. With that, I'm going to make sure that my brush is nice and damp, and now I'm going to try to create this pigment that's right around the edge of these areas right here, and it's much brighter. So I'm going to begin with a pigment we already know and we know well. I'm going to take some of this, I'll move it over here on my palette, and I'm going to grab a hint of my primary yellow, which is a bit of a brighter yellow. Just like that. I'll add a hint of my primary red, and now I have a yellowish orange, which I'll test on the edge here. And that's a little bit too orange, so I'll take some extra primary yellow, I'll take a little bit of titanium white, we'll mix those two together, and now I'll test this. And that looks really, really good. So, with this new pigment, I'm going to go along the edges of our tree and our foliage here, and I'm just going to work it softly around. And we're creating this very bright, saturated, vibrant yellow here because light is passing through the bushes and the foliage, and it's really illuminating them, it's brightening it, it's bringing out all of this warm color, and that's essentially what we're left with. Then it gets a little bit more pink, it gets a little bit more red, so I'll take some extra primary red, I'll mix that in there. Primary red and primary yellow will mix to make an orange, but when you have a lot of titanium white in there, the red and the white are going to make more of a pink. And I think I'm actually looking for something that is slightly more pink, so I'm adding hints more of the white and the red. And then I'll test this right on there. It's a little bit bright. It could use a little bit more red. And I'm going to darken it again with a hint of burnt umber. And now we'll test this. And that is extremely close, which is great. Now I'm going to work this in behind that yellow that we have. I can be relatively loose with this because I'm going to go back in and do a soft blend with it fairly soon. But right now I'm just creating this soft, nice edging here. There we go. And it looks like it kind of carries forward down here. The yellow dissipates. And the yellow also doesn't present itself up here, but this nice, warm, pinkish orange does. There we go. We're using a lot of colors you wouldn't really think to mix. All of these extra pinks in a sunset is kind of interesting, but it looks quite good in the reference photo. And again, another great reason to use a reference photo. So from that, we have these strokes, and they're all fairly loose. You can see that it's paint being added to the canvas, which I personally like, but this is a background. We're going to make it softer so that it sinks into the background so that we don't have these stark edges. So I'm going to start with a slightly damp brush, this round-headed brush, and I'm going to make these little blends and taps around the edges right here. And it's going to blend the yellow into the white or the off-white, and it's going to blend the pink into the yellow, just like so. It's going to create this soft look of light passing through the leaves on the edge here. And I'm doing lots of little taps, that way I get soft impressions and blends, as you can see. There we go. Now that looks much more dramatic than that, but it's because we don't have the darker colors kind of blending out into it quite yet. But we will get there. We can also take slightly more pink and work that over a lot more of the yellow, which is something that can warm it up to a good extent. Now here I'm going to throw in a bit of burnt sienna just to see how that works. It should be fairly warm and nice, and I'm also going to throw some cadmium yellow deep hue instead of my primary yellow, just to create something a little bit different, make it interesting. And I'm mixing this on top of my initial mixture so I can see on the side what the initial mixture really looked like. That way I know I'm getting something close. And I'm just going to make this a little bit darker than that initial mixture, because as we move inwards, as you can see, it gets a little bit darker. See how bright that is right there? We don't want it as bright as we get farther in. It works more so on the edge, but it doesn't work as we move in. There we go. And that's certainly closer. Can make it a little bit darker again with some extra burnt umber. Still not ready to use Mars Black, as I do think it'll make it greenish. Now we can take this and we can work this in a little bit and blend it out into the yellowish pink as well. I have quite a bit on my brush, so I'm getting a fairly liberal application. There we go. Kind of playing with the shape a little bit, I noticed that this kind of dips up that I didn't have drawn in because it's more of a soft blend than an actual outline. And yet again, I'm going to go in now and blend a little bit, make this all a bit softer. There we go. Now we can start moving into the actual piece. And there are all of these little openings, but I'm going to worry about those later. They're a little bit too complicated to work around, so instead we're going to paint the entire thing with this base layer, and then we're going to add these on top. So let's mix this quite dark pigment. It looks like it could have quite a bit of brown, but it's still warm. So I'm just going to take a lot of this burnt umber, work it in here, but I really can't get it any darker than that burnt umber. So at this point, we need to start working with the Mars Black. So we'll throw that in, and now we'll test it. It's still a little bit bright, so we'll take some more Mars Black. Not too much. Mars Black is a very strong pigment. Quickly overwhelm everything else you have. We'll give that a try, and that is much more close. Now you may have to move around the reference photo a little bit as you add paint to it, because from some angles it'll be really reflective and deceiving, but on others you'll see the actual innate coloring. And this is very similar. I can see that it's very reflective from my angle, but if I move this way and I look at it, it looks proper. So that's what I'm starting with here. And then I'm going to apply this initially around the outskirts, as you can see here. And I'm not worrying about the blending process just yet. We will get there. I'm just doing a solid initial application that's going to be consistent from top to bottom. If we started blending now, we'd start taking bits of the yellow, the white, the orange, mixing it in with this, and then as we move down, it would progressively get brighter and brighter because we get more of that in there, which is why we're breaking this down into a couple of steps. There we go. Now I'm just taking off that excess paint, making my brush nice and clean, and now I'm going to go back in and create those soft blends that we had before. Which is again why this smaller round-headed brush is just so great. Just moving it up in some fun ways. Here I can see it dips out, so I'll have that dip. As you move it towards the edges, it will get a little bit more bright, but that's okay. Again, I'm not trying to make it exactly like the reference photo. If we were to do that, I'd probably want to spend 12 or so hours here at the easel. I'm just using it to get a good estimate of the colors to make sure that they're interesting and not boring like the first time I tried to do this painting. So I start there, and then I'm going to switch to my larger flat-headed brush because there's a lot of space in here to fill now. And doing it with that smaller brush would be very tedious. So here I'm going to mix more of this paint. I'm going to leave this corner of it open, that way I know what area I'm trying to mix to. As you can see, this is a little too brown. It's not dark enough. We'll grab more Mars Black. I'm using the corner of my brush initially to grab it, that way I don't move all of this bright pigment into my Mars Black. And I'm going to need a little bit of titanium white as well. It is a bit darker than our initial mixture, but you know what, that actually makes sense as we move farther back into this area. Again, we're creating more of that vignette effect. So I'm going to add a little bit of titanium white to brighten it up, but not too much. And that's fairly similar, it's just a little bit darker. Or so I thought. It may actually be a little bit lighter. Let's work a little bit more Mars Black in again. There we go. And now I'll work it really wherever I'd like. We're just filling in this area. We can use the edges to kind of blend back into this if you'd like, but if you aren't comfortable with blending with the flat-headed brush because it has that sharp edge, I would fully understand it is certainly easier with the round-headed brush, so you could apply all of this and then go back in with the round-headed brush and soften the edges as we've been doing throughout the rest of the process. Remember that this really isn't meant to look like anything at this point. It will be a tree in the distance that has a a good amount of light leaking through, but it is in the distance where we don't see the detail. This is taken with a camera that has a aperture that's quite low, so it's more probably around 1.7, 2 point something. It's not a high aperture, it's not letting a lot of detail from the background in, and because of that we need to make sure our image is nice and focused on the flower. So this is used in photography, by the way, to draw the eye to a main subject. You make the background a little bit more blurry. There's a fairly similar thing that happens with our eye, right? Because as we look at something in the foreground, we can see all the detail. As things get farther and farther away, they become mere implications of what that subject is visually in the foreground, and that's just doing more of that. Here I'm doing a little bit of a tap along the edge because it's giving me a softer application. There we go. That's great. Now I'm going to take a couple of steps back and kind of compare both the photo and the painting, but also just look at the blending along the edge to see if it's enough. I can see slight brush strokes in there, but as you know, I really like looking at my acrylic paintings and seeing that they are paintings, so I like to keep a little bit of a brush stroke in there, even in the softer areas. But we'll take a couple of steps back and see. So, stepping back, I realized a couple things. One, just how reflective this was from the angle in which you were at. And it can be very deceiving, and it's an important lesson to have. It's that, depending upon your angle on the canvas, things aren't going to look like their natural color because they're going to be so reflective. Something I did in the moment just to make that better, and I'm sure you can see a big difference. I took my easel, and instead of having it like this, I moved it back a little bit. So the light hit it in a different way, and now we have a better perspective of what it looks like. Now, something else I'm noticing from stepping back is, look how orange and almost purpley this is right here. And then if you look over here, you see how much more brown it is. So we can keep it as more of an earthy tone there, or we can move it to more of that color. I figure this is a painting lesson. While I do like the earthy tones, I should show you how to do that as well. So let's do just that. Now, we don't have any purple here on our palette, but we can mix some by taking a little bit of our primary blue. We're going to take a little bit of our primary red. I'm using different corners of my brush. That way I don't dilute either of the pigments, and then I'll blend them here together on the canvas, or rather on the palette. Not ready for the canvas just yet. I'm going to take some burnt sienna just to make it a little bit more earthy, just like that. And now we'll test it over here. And that actually, it looks a little bit too earthy. So you know what? I take some extra blue, I'll take some extra red, I'll mix those two together. A little bit more red. And I'll take some titanium white as well, that way we can actually see some of the color in this. And here, now you can see that it's much brighter, how it leans towards blue. So I'm going to take some extra red and bring that back in there. This is going to darken it a little bit because red is darker than white, but it's also going to bring me closer to purple. Sometimes your blues will be much stronger pigments than reds, so when you try to mix a purple and you go half and half, it'll look more like blue than it will purple. So now we'll try that, and that's definitely closer. Now if I apply this to what we already have here, it will become a little bit more brown because we still have all of that brown paint, but what we can do, we can start applying it over here. And I think it's fairly close. This should be a bit darker, it should be a bit more earthy, but we can start our base layer over here. Just like that. So this side we started from the edge and we worked in. This side we'll work on the inside and we'll work out to the edge. Once this is more dry, we'll go back in and add more purple, and we'll soon go back and add more of an earthy tone to this. So we're just trying to find the right balance. We have a couple of different areas to try and do so, and that's a great thing. There we go. You can see just how thin the purple is though in comparison to this over here. So we'll have to do either a couple of layers or just a little bit more titanium white and Mars black in the mixture. It's a little bit too red, so add some extra blue. When you are trying to find the right color, it's really just about figuring out what the color is, what you want to make it. So if it's a little bit too red, it looks like red, you want to make it purple, you know you need to add more blue. If it's starting to look blue, you know you need to add more red. If it's starting to look a little too dark, add some titanium white. If it looks too light, add some Mars black. If you want it to be a little bit more earthy, grab some burnt umber or burnt sienna. And eventually you'll get to where you want to be. There we go. It's a little bit more thick. It's a little bit more earthy. Already making improvements. I'm not going too close to the edge because I do want those other pigments in there. But now I'll go back and I'll grab some of that burnt umber that we had and that more earthy mixture and I'll mix it into this. As you can see, it's much more thick already. And I don't have much of this, so I'll have to remix a bit of it here. Not too concerned about it. We've done it a couple times. We have a good idea of how to go about doing it at this point. And I'm just trying to mix the color that there is along the edge. There we go. Now, of course, this is mixing with the purple. And we're just getting that nice balance. You can test it over here. And that looks incredibly close. I might say next to perfect. So it's one of those things where we looked at this initially and we said there's a lot of reds, oranges, yellows, maybe we'll just make it darker. But it actually leaned a little bit more towards purple, which is interesting. Now I'm going to take this purple pigment that I have on my brush, that I've been mixing over here, and I'm just going to work it over into this side because it's fairly dry at this point, and now we can start applying on this new layer and making it what we want it to be. Take a little bit of extra red, throw that in there. Make it nice and warm. If we added a lot of blue, it might look a little bit more cool. That said, reds aren't always warm and blues aren't always cool. There are warm and cool versions of each pigment. There we go. Now I'm going to clean my brush. Take a little bit more of this burnt umber, dark earthy mixture. Work that back into here. Just make sure that I don't have any pure purple areas and that it's all nicely applied. Then I'm also going to take some of this. I'm going to work it along the bottom of my painting. Avoid my stem and my leaf. And we'll create this darker foreground area. This will frame the painting, and it'll give it a bit of a vignette as well. Again, so the eye doesn't get lost down here. Now I'm cleaning my brush, taking off that excess paint, and I'll take a couple steps back and just see how the painting's coming along now. So here, this is great, this is really, really good. I can see in the viewfinder of the camera that this is very reflective, this is not. Again, it's because of the perspective of how we're looking at it. This and this are now the same color. I can see as I move around the room, but they look different because of the amount of reflection and the hues that they're reflecting. So again, it's a good reminder to move around the room, to move around your lighting and your painting, as things can be quite deceiving. So with that though, I really like how this is turning out. I think that it's going quite well. I'm ready to work on the edge here, and then once I'm done the edge, we'll go back into the middle areas and add all of those nice kind of leaks of light that are working through these areas. So for this next step, I'm going back to my medium-sized round-headed brush, and then I'm remembering that my water here is quite diluted. We've been using blues, we've been mixing blues into our water, and our water is no longer suited for working with yellows. Because now if I take yellows and I try to create that nice outer edge, I'm going to mix it into this water, it's going to get diluted, it's going to get some blues mixed into it, it's going to start creating greens, and then this edge cannot match that edge. So what we really need to do, we need to clean our water, and we should also clean our brushes, take out any of those blues as well. This is a great opportunity to go back and clean this brush. Remember, we did a light clean in here, but we didn't do a true clean. Good to go. Really put it under the tap, clean it well, and make sure that it doesn't have any paint kind of internally hardening in there. So let's clean everything, take a 5-minute break, and then we'll be right back and work along this edge. So, all is well. We have clean water, we have clean brushes, and I can get back to this. I'm going to begin not with the orange here that we have, but with the yellow. And I'm starting with the yellow because it's going to be uncontested. It's going to be unmixed with other pigments. If this is dry, it'll just work on top of it. We won't have it touching this purple. And that's really important because if we did the orange first, then it would blend a little bit with this currently wet purple. The yellows in the orange might mix with the blues in the purple, and we might get a little bit of a green. So I want to let this dry a little bit, and I also don't want to do that and then allow those greens to carry on into the yellow where it will really be noticeable. You can kind of get away with it in oranges and pinks, but with yellow it's just too delicate. So let's start by mixing the yellow that we have over here on the edge. I don't have it on my palette anymore, so we'll just have to remix it. That's okay though. I'll start with a little bit of my warmer cadmium yellow. I'll just put that right there. Get a little bit of my primary yellow as well. Just get a good mix. I'll add a hint of primary red. It's making it quite orange. I'll add a good amount of titanium white, just like that. And now I'll test it, and I can test it in two places. I can test it over here. I like it. It's a little bit less saturated than the yellow that we have on the reference photo. Let's test it over here. Again, it's a little bit less saturated. I think it's a nice warm color. I actually like it a lot, maybe more so than that yellow. So this just goes to show that the reference photo won't always be right. You can make changes, you can take artistic liberties, make it the way you want, but at least now we know it's very close and it will work in the context of our painting. So I'm going to begin by working this along the edge of our background. As you can see, I'm making it fairly close to this. It's not exact though. Again, if you want perfect realism, I'd take this reference photo, I'd match color by color, and I'd probably spend 6 to 10 more hours on it. But as you know from the channel, realism is rarely ever my final goal. I like to take realistic things, and then I like to heighten them a little bit. So I increase color, saturations, contrasts, or I mute different things, but I essentially just try to take the essence of the subject and heighten it in one way or another. And that means changing things here and there, and that's what we're doing. So I'm taking this, I've applied it along the edge, it worked really well. I can go back and I can add a little bit of it over into this one as well. And by taking it from here and putting it over here, while it's a little bit different, it makes it cohesive in the painting, which is great. And because yellow is such a delicate, thin color, generally doing a couple layers like I'm doing right now is a good thing to do. So we're getting a lot of benefits from this secondary application. You can probably see it getting just significantly better quickly. There we go. Now I'm going to come back and I'm going to soften these edges a little bit. So I'm going over them with these very light strokes, and I'm blending it on top of the dry background that we have. It'll leave little strokes here and there, but if you wanted it to be really smooth, you could add a lot of extra water to your brush, make it quite damp, not wet, but again quite damp, and move that on top of this, and you get a very soft gradient going onto the sky area. Here I'm okay if it has a little bit more form and brush stroke. Then as you can see, the pigment, it actually moves down here in the painting, and here I'll apply a little bit. You can see just how well that mixes. I know it'll work in this area now, and I can actually bring that down here. So I'll start with just a line, like so. Take off a little bit of that paint. Take a little bit more titanium white, move that in. My brush is nice and damp. And then I'll apply this on top of that application I just applied. And this will be the light hitting the field and kind of bouncing up and getting lost in the actual sky. So there'll be a really nice effect. There we go. Turned out quite well. Nice and easy. Great when we can make it so cohesive and have things kind of blend from one side to the other. Now we're going to go back in and mix more of this orange. Again, I don't really have much on my palette, except it might be this. It's probably not this. It's probably lost under there. So I'll take the pigment that I currently have. I'll throw a bit of extra red in there. And I'll throw a little bit of extra cadmium yellow deep hue. Grabbed a lot, so I will grab more red. It's kind of this balance going back and forth. This looks quite dark at this point. I don't think this will match. I'll test it. It does not. It's also too saturated, so we'll take some titanium white. This will brighten it and desaturate it. There we go. Now we can test it, of course, on here. It's a little bit brighter. You can test it over here. It's a little bit brighter. So what I'll do, I'll take a little bit of burnt sienna because it's darker, but it's still warm. And I'll work that into our mixture. And now I'll work this. Well, I won't start working it. I'll test it first. That's the point of having our reference photo and our other side. We can test. And that looks genuinely perfect. See? We just need to keep trying. So, now I might actually take a little bit of this and kind of work it back into here a little bit just before I begin. Why? Because as I've been working, I've seen little areas that I've wanted to touch up over here, and now I have the pigment to do it. So, just go back, touch up a couple of these edges. Now that it's on both sides, it'll work really well. It'll be cohesive. Gave us a little bit of extra time to dry over here. And now I'll take this and I'll work it in between the purple and the yellow. I'm not going to blend any of it yet. The purple is dry. It's fairly important that the purple is dry for this next step. If your purple is not dry, give it 5 or 10 more minutes. Let it get there. And then come back in and apply this. And this is actually the same color that we'll use down here. We'll make it a little bit darker, as you can see. This is a bit bright, but it's very similar, so I can actually just blend this down into here. And now we know we just need a slightly darker version of that. So, from there, let's head back up into the side, and let's blend this into the yellow. I don't have any pigment on my brush right now. It's just damp. I'm moving that paint on top of the yellow. Not entirely, I'm still leaving the edges to be that pure yellow mixture we had, but I'm bringing it out a little bit to layer it on top. I'm also going to take a little bit of this and run it down here and just blend it with the yellow that we have as well. Again, making it nice and cohesive. Now we need to blend it back into this darker area. And this can be difficult because, watch this. I'll take it. I'll start layering it on top, but oh no, you can still see the line work from that darker pigment. That's because it's much easier to layer dark pigments on top of light pigments than it is to layer light pigments on top of dark pigments. Generally, you don't see the light pigments through darker pigments, but you do see the darker pigments through light pigments. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take more of the purple and more of the burnt umber that I have here. I'll apply this to the side, like so. Just like that. And then I'll start to do a slight blend. So again, little taps, not much pressure at all. Little sweeping motions with the brush. You can see how they're getting softer, blending together. There we go. It's a little bit of a different look than this side over here, but it's fairly close, and it can show you how blending things in two different ways will give you a different effect. So here we started lightest pigment, middle tone pigment, darkest pigment. Here we went darkest, lightest, middle tone blend. So you'll get a different look depending upon how you decide to blend your pigments, but I actually like this a lot as well. I think they're both really nice. It all depends on how you want to layer your painting and what look you're going for. So now you have two different examples of how you can go about doing that sort of thing. Now I did just grab a little bit of blue. It was on my brush, it was in my water, but as you can see it's fairly undiluted, as is the brush. So I'm going to continue without cleaning the water, but if you feel like you picked up a good amount of blue, if you were remixing that and your water does have that blue, I would highly recommend cleaning your water and your brush. So that is a good start. I talked about wanting to go in and incorporate these kind of brighter areas, but I do want this to be fully dry before I do that, so I'm going to take a little bit of a break and I'm going to work down here and create this color. So I have this warm version, which we know is quite close to that, but it just needs to be a little bit darker. So take a little bit more burnt sienna, work that in, a little bit more primary red. That was a lot of primary red. Okay, we'll get more burnt sienna. We'll get some more cadmium yellow deep hue. We'll need more titanium white, desaturate it a little bit. And let's test that. It's far too bright, it's a little bit too yellow. Take more of that burnt sienna. Take more of our primary red to get rid of the yellow. These will also darken it. We'll try that. It's closer. I think it needs to be a bit brighter now, a little bit more pink. So take more titanium white because it'll mix with the red. Make it more pink. We'll try this. Now it's a little bit too bright. More primary red, yet again. We'll grab a little bit of burnt umber this time, just to make it darker without adding the warmth of the burnt sienna. That is much closer. I think it just needs a hint more pink. So a hint more primary red, hint more titanium white. We'll make it a little bit darker again. It's all about a back and forth. Test it. It's really close to the top color. It's not as close to the bottom. So I'll make it a little bit darker again. A little more red. We're essentially taking out a lot of yellow here in this process. And that looks really close. I like that a lot. So now, we'll just take this. And I'm using the round-headed brush because I want a soft blend into this, and into this. Now, this is a fairly bright pigment, but I'm layering it over a dark pigment, and I'm able to do that because it's so thick. I have a lot of paint here that occurred from all of the mixing going back and forth that I did, and that is the kind of how you beat the obstacle that is the difficulty in layering a light color over a dark color. You just need a lot of pigment on your brush, you don't spread it much, and you don't have a lot of water. It means it'll be a little bit more difficult to render a sharp line, but it will be doable and you'll be able to cover what you want to. Now I'm just going to move over here to the left-hand side, fill in all of this. As you can see, I'm touching the top horizon line. I'm working my way roughly around my foreground subjects. I'm working it down into the bottom. And now it's time for a soft blend. And how do we do that? We do little taps. We'll just blend it. We'll allow it to dissipate. I'm running out of paint on my brush, and if you still have a lot of paint on your brush, you can kind of just wipe it off on your little painting cloth. And then you can allow it to continue to become lesser and lesser, as seen here. Now I want to blend the top into the yellow a little bit, so I'll do these little taps again. Clean that up. And then we'll head back here. There we go. So from there, we've done a lot. We've covered a lot of area. I'm going to stand up, take a couple of steps back, see how it's turning out. It's a little bit less red and pink than the version that we have on the reference photo. But again, I'm okay with that. I do want it to be a little bit more earthy, and at the end, if we want to glaze on a little bit more of that kind of rosy color, we can do that. I have another reference photo in here that is a little bit more yellow and orange based than the pink and rosy. And this is just kind of the printer doing different things that does occur. If you have a printer that can be a little bit less consistent, print it out a couple of times. That way you have a couple of different versions. Kind of pick your favorite and work from that. That said, I'm quite happy with this. As we've gone, I feel like we've got so much more interesting colors because of this. And if we want to make this a little bit more rosy in the now, we can just take a little bit of primary red, a little bit of burnt sienna, a little bit of titanium white. You can see we have almost a true pink here. Add in some extra burnt sienna, red. Test that there. See, that's much more pink than what we have. Much more saturated. Take some extra titanium white. When you combine the two, it's quite close, and you can just take this and work it in there as well. So if you step back and you decide you want it to be a little bit different, you can still make it different. You can still change it. You can still add pigments, cover up pigments, blend further. I think it was nice the first time. I think it's nice now. I'm just taking this, working it up into these a little bit more. And of course, I'm going to go back with a wet brush. I'm going to brace my finger on a non-wet, unfinished area of the painting. That way I take any shake out of my hand. And I'm just going to go over this edge with this wet brush. Make it a little bit softer. If there's any tooth of the canvas showing through, this should help remedy it. Now I'll take another step back. It's a little bit more pink. It's still not as pink as that, but again, should we want to do a glaze later, we can do that. So I'm very happy with where we've come so far. It's time to start working in these little guys. Now these are actually the same pigment that we have right here on the edge. However, they're going to be various versions of value. So this one, it's a little bit darker, this one's a little bit lighter. As they overlap each other, they get even brighter again. So what we're going to do, we're going to take these pigments that we've been using down here and on the edge, we're going to find an area that we really want them. We're going to apply this. There we go. So that represents one that we have on there. And I'm applying it with fairly thick paint, that way it actually covers up the darker application. Remember, if it's very thin and you have a lot of water, it won't cover up much. Now I'll create another one right about here. I'm making them relatively circular. Another one here on the side of the canvas. A connecting piece. There we go. And as I continue to do this, you can see that I'm actually kind of running out of paint here on my brush, and these are getting less and less sharp. They're getting more and more transparent, getting less and less bright. So we need to remember to go back and continuously mix more paint. Now I'm just about out of titanium white, so I'll reach across there, grab a little bit more, apply that to the palette. And I'll continue mixing this pigment that we have here that has been working so well for us in the rest of the painting. There we go. Nice and easy to mix at this point because we've done it so much. And as I go over those applications a second time, you can see that they become much, much more stark. And that's because we're now applying light pigments over light pigments rather than light pigments over dark pigments. That said, we don't want to do that to all of them because we do want some of them to remain a bit darker. So I'm going to continue applying this. I'm going to allow the pigment on my brush to naturally kind of run out. And as that happens, I'll get these slightly darker applications, which will be quite interesting. I'm matching it semi-closely to the pattern that we have over here. That's going to help me instigate a lot of diversity. If we just kind of did it off the top of our head, we'd probably run into similar clusters in different areas, and it might become oversimplified, which we don't want. So it's great to work from the reference photo, but I'm not going to get caught up in making it absolutely perfect. I am okay with having slight inconsistencies here and there. Again, if we wanted perfect realism, we'd probably need to spend a couple extra hours at the canvas. And I don't think perfect realism is the goal for all of us. It can be a really nice technique, but it isn't necessary. There we go. Now, I'm not done over here, but I want to let that dry, and I want to sit with it for a while, see how much I want to add, what I want to do with it. So I'm going to pop over onto this side, and I'll create some of these as well. Creating these nice little patterns in here. It's a really neat effect. Letting my paint run out. This one's a bit darker. Again, we need those darker ones. We need them to be of varying sizes as well. So make sure that you're progressively changing that as we go along. There we go. As you see, it's running out. We're getting that nice difference. Now that it's running out, I'm going to go back over here, add a couple more. Making sure that I'm changing the size and the shape. Now we can come back in here. We've had some time to sit with it. Now we have a better reference of how many we may want. There will probably be more closer to the edges because there will be more openings in the foliage. Changing the color minorly. Create some extra diversity. Getting a little bit quiet here just because I'm focusing on that diversity, just making sure it is different and evolving. There we go. I'm going over some previously applied areas with new paint, and I'm also remembering that these need to overlap to a point. So here I just overlapped that one with that one. These are very overlapped. It'll just kind of look polka dotted if you don't do that overlapping effect. We don't want that. There we go. Now all of these actually need slightly softer edges. Because these edges are soft, it wouldn't make sense if these edges were hard. So I'm going to go back in with just a wet brush and I'm going to blend out these edges. And it'll make it look like the light is working through the trees, and then along the edges it gets a little bit more thick and dense, and then it becomes lesser. Now some of these have fully dried, so I'm not going to be able to move the paint out over the darker areas, but some of them are wet, so I'll be able to pick up a little bit of that paint and move it to other ones and use it to make it look like it's being moved out and it's giving it this kind of glowy effect. You can also always grab more paint to do those edges as well. I feel like it adds so much to this when we start adding in those edges. It's just this finishing little touch, which actually isn't our finishing touch. We will do more to these, but it just adds so much dimension to them. It makes it fit contextually in with the background. I'm working in this little circular movement, by the way, because that's just going to give me a bit of a softer look. There we go. No hard edges. Including along the edges here. Started to run out of paint, so I'm just mixing up a little bit more. I'm using the edges as a reference to make sure that I get it relatively close. Here you can see it's far too yellow, so I'll grab some extra red. Now it's far too red, so I'll grab some extra burnt sienna. It's far too dark, so I'll add some extra titanium white. Needs a little bit more yellow, be a hint more orange. A little bit more pink. And there we go. Now I have a lot of pigment on my brush because that was a lot of mixing, so I'm going to take a bit of that off. Grab a little bit more, come back in, continue to create those nice soft edges, and I'm even accentuating it on the sides of these as well. These being the edges of our trees. Now I said earlier that this was a nice finishing touch. That wasn't our finishing touch because we had another step. And that next step is creating really large areas where the light kind of breaks through and then it expands and it opens up. This will just be an extra great detail. So I'm going to use some fairly watered down mixture. As you can see, I'm grabbing a little bit of extra water, moving that into my pigment, making it more of a watercolor consistency. And then I'll apply that in some areas really large. This will blend things together a little bit more. It'll brighten some of these significantly darker areas. It'll make some areas feel more cohesive. These will need soft edges, so I'll go back in and work that around as well. But it's very thin paint that's just going to brighten some areas and bring areas together. It'll be quite reflective when you first apply it. So recognize that it is something you'll have to let dry to a point to see properly or move around the canvas in the room, which is exactly what I'm going to do now. Now that I feel like is coming along really well. I like the technique, but when I look back to the reference photo, and this is why it's good to have a reference photo, I notice that I have far more implications now than the reference photo does. So what do? I've done too much. This is actually something I like to do in my painting, and it's I aim to do something and then I do a little bit more of it than I actually like, and then I work my way back to get it to how I like. And that way I know the exact point of where I feel it's perfect. Because some of us, we question, well, when's my painting finished? When's this area finished? I don't want to do too much and ruin it. Where I like to do a little bit too much. Not to the point where it's hypothetically ruined, but to the point where I know, okay, this is pushing it a little bit, I'll just walk it back. I'll cover up areas again. And that's exactly what we're going to do. So, I'm going to remix the pigment that we have there. I'll take a hint of blue, take a hint of primary red, a little bit more primary red because primary blue is a bit stronger. Take some of my burnt umber, take a little bit of my Mars black, and a hint of our titanium white. And that looks really close to what we have there. So now we can simplify. And I can look at areas and I'm like, okay, you know what, that's a little bit too much, so we'll cover that up. And if our brush is very wet, you'll kind of see the light showing through. So what you'll need to do is A, dry off your brush a little bit, or do what I'm doing here and just mix more paint. Remember, the more paint you mix, the more paint you can grab, the more thick the application will be, the better coverage you will have, the less layers you will have to do. There we go. It's a little bit too blue. Add in some extra red. Much better. Grab a little bit more red. And now I'm just going to simplify. So I'll take some of these areas and I'll take a couple of these bad boys out. There we go. It looks much more elegant now, doesn't it? But I wouldn't have known where I wanted all of these had I not tried and done all of the extra. I could have followed the reference photo perfectly, but I might not perfectly love what the reference photo has, right? The reference photo is a great way to remind me to jump around, to change the size, to play with the color, to overlap and add that extra light. But in the end, the reference photo isn't king. What is your opinion of your painting. And so, this is how I like to work with reference photos. There we go. Now I like that side a lot more than that side. Let's do the same over here. And I'm looking at the reference photo back and forth to see what I've changed, what I like better, what I don't like better. And then I'm kind of covering up the areas that I just don't have that much of an affinity for. There we go. Starting to run out of paint here. Don't feel like we need this bright piece in the middle. Mix up some more paint. There we are. Don't need that much blue. If you grab a little bit too much, you don't need to commit to it. You don't need to add it to your mixture. You can just kind of place it off on the side. There we are. That's much better. Going in, I'm softening some of these edges with a little bit of a tap, as you can see. Again, I'm a little bit more quiet in this because it's this constant process of asking myself, does this one work? Does this one work? Does this one work? And just kind of bouncing around and working through it. I think we're almost done this side right here. Going to clean my brush off a little bit, take a couple steps back, and again, give it another good look. And I actually think that is so much better. I like that a lot more. I think that it's really nice. It has this almost painterly effect. You can tell there's a little bit of a brush stroke. You have all of these different beautiful colors. You have the pinks, you have the oranges, you have the purples, you have the blues. You have some slight greens in there from working the really light, thin orange on top of what we had because there was some black and some yellow. And I feel like we have a very complex color profile happening right now, which is wonderful. So from there, we're going to move on, and we're going to move on to our stem and our leaves, which is done with a green, which we haven't used, which we don't have on our palette. But that is okay because we're going to mix it very simply. And I'm going to do that with the medium-sized flat-headed brush. Again, this is 1 centimeter wide. I like this brush a lot for areas that are sharp, like the edges here, but also have a good amount of surface area. So let's mix a green. I'm going to start with some primary blue. Put that right here, new area on my palette. I'll take the other corner of my brush, I'll grab some cadmium yellow deep hue, I'll grab a little bit of primary yellow as well, and I'll mix those two together. And just like that, we have a nice green. Let's test that green. I bet it's a little too vibrant, a little too dark, and that's exactly what it is. So let's tone it down. Let's grab some titanium white, which as we know will brighten it and take out saturation. Now let's test it. Now it's a little bit too bright, but the saturation's quite close to what we want. So I'll take some Mars Black to darken it. Just a hint because Mars Black is such a strong pigment. As you can see, I used a hint of it and it already did quite a number on that. Here I'll test it again, and that is really, really close. So I will start with this here. Take my pinky finger, brace it on part of my canvas which isn't wet. I'll run down the lines, the edges of our greenery here, and I'll blend it in. There we go. Now as you can tell, it's quite thin. It's because I've been using a lot of water, which is great for creating those sharp lines, but it makes that a fairly thin edge. So I'll just mix more paint, get some of that primary blue. I'll skip the primary yellow this time and just go with the cadmium yellow deep hue. It's a little bit more thick. Blend these together, grab a hint of Mars Black. And there we go. Same color, same value, but now it's much more thick and we can really see it. Much better. I have a little piece of greenery back here. Going to protrude. And right now I'm just painting this all in one flat pigment. There isn't a lot of depth going on, there isn't a gradient happening. Don't worry, we will build that in. I'm just putting in our basics, and then we will build out from there. Working my way relatively delicately around these petals here. I don't want green overlapping my petals because it is going to turn the petal green, because if you add a yellow on top of a green, it will look like a green. We need a very thick yellow, and most yellows aren't thick at all. So I'll start with that. That's working really well. Now for the inside of the leaf, I know that I need to add a little bit of orange to it. So I'll take some yellow and some red. I'll mix those two in there. And I need to do this because the light's passing through that green, so we get a little bit more of a warm tone. I wouldn't really think to do this way, but I saw it in the reference photo and I said, hey, you know what? That works really well. There we go. And I'll add a little bit of this warm tone to the edges of my stem as well. Now we've covered the majority of this. Actually, I'll take a little bit more of that not warm blue and I'll just finish the bottom here. But now that we've added the majority of that, we'll work on the leaf. And for that, I do want a little bit of the warmth showing through, so I'll mix it into the orange that we had. I'll make it a little bit darker because the light isn't directly hitting it. And I'll apply this, starting on the edges, like so. And now we'll move it in. As you can tell, as I start to move in, I'm really losing paint. It's getting much more gritty. We can see that tooth of the canvas, which we don't want. So I'm going to mix more paint. That way we don't run into the issue of making it too thin or look unfinished. I added a little bit of primary red in here, which is going to mix with the yellow to make it a little bit more orange, but when you mix red with green, you generally desaturate the pigment a little bit as well, which isn't a bad thing. Creating some little protruding edges here that I see in the reference photo. There we go. Now this is a bit darker, so this is great. We can actually use this in another area of the painting and make it cohesive. So I have this. The light is coming this way, right? So it'll wrap its way around both sides of the stem. But this back area, the area that's facing us, isn't going to have any direct light. It'll have light that's kind of reflecting back onto it a little bit, but for the most part, this middle area, it's going to be darker because it's not having that light hit it directly. So I'm actually going to darken the middle area by just taking this pigment, working it into the middle of the stem, and then I'll do a soft little blend on the sides of it so it isn't just a single hard stroke. And there we go. We have a little bit of depth worked in. We can even do it under this leaf right here, and then into that stem as well. Just like that. Now we need to start adding some warmth and some light to it. Now I'm going to do that with the smaller square-headed brush because it's nice and detail-oriented. And for this, I actually am going to mix up a bit of an orange right next to our green. That way I know what we're working with. Take a little bit of my titanium white. Make it a little bit more orange than yellow. A little bit more pink. That way it doesn't turn to green. And this is for the outline that you kind of see around here. I'm testing it. It's incredibly close. That worked out really, really well. And I can take this now, and I can work this just along those edges, showing that nice warm color working its way around here. And then I'll blend it in a little bit as well, just making sure that this is nice and warm. There we go. Now it's nice and cohesive with the rest of the painting. As I move farther back, it becomes less and less so. You want it dominantly on the edges, and then you want it to slowly move in a little bit. Again, here we have an edge, so make it nice and dominant. The light hitting, reflecting off that leaf, maybe even working through it a little bit, and then wrapping its way in and around it a little bit as well. Creating a lot of depth, creating a nice warm area. Thicken the pigment again here. Working it along these edges, and this edge too, because this edge will catch a little bit of light. So now you have the inside of the leaf that's really exposed, which is nice. And of course I'll blend this bright pigment into that warmer inner area of the leaf as well. There we go. And you can see the more of this that we do, the more depth in this we create. Starting to run out of paint, so I'm just mixing a bit more. There we go. Can't forget about this little leaf up top. And now we have this big one down here to work on as well. So I'll just touch this up a little bit because I just saw it and I thought, hey, you know what, we could do a little bit more here. But now coming down to this one, the edges are going to be quite bright. They're going to have this highlight. It's actually a little bit brighter than the backing color we have there, so I'll grab some extra titanium white. I'll mix that up. And then I'll almost just tap this on because it's a light pigment going on top of darker pigments. So it'll be a little bit more thin, and we want it to stand out. So I don't want it to blend much, and by just tapping it lightly, I don't press the bristles into the canvas. The bristles don't expand, they don't spread that paint out. So just with a very light touch, I'm touching paint to paint rather than bristle to canvas. And this is helping me sustain a much more consistent stroke. Here I'm mixing up a little bit more paint. Continuing my tapping method. Don't kind of let the green go out farther than this. Make sure that it truly is on the edge. If it doesn't happen like that, it'll look a little bit sloppy. So make sure that this is the true edge. There we go. We can take some of this, work it back over these areas again. And I'm doing these so many times simply because, again, we're working it over a darker pigment, and you need to build up that light generally to get it the way you really want to. Take a wet brush, I'll go back in and I'll blend this a little bit. Just make it a bit softer. There we go. This green's a bit more saturated than what we have here, but I really wanted to bring it out. I wanted it to stand out a bit more than this one does. So by making the green slightly more saturated, we achieve just that. Now we have the spine of the leaves. So I'm just going to tap that in yet again. just like so. Trying to make them different, sprawl out. I'm following this fairly roughly, but I am looking at it as a good reference. Here, for example, I can see that there's another piece that comes out from here, not from the spine. And then it kind of jets out into two waves, which is nice. It's this added bit of diversity we wouldn't have had I just kind of tried to come up with it myself. And I'm adding a little bit of this light into it and then blending it back into the edge and into the leaf. There we go. Now we've mixed this color a couple of times, so it's changed minorly. So I'm just going to throw it back into some of the other leaves just to make it nice and cohesive and make sure that we have something really consistent in our painting. There we go. Now I'm going to take a couple of steps back and see how it's progressing. So after stepping back, I realized again just how dominant this is in comparison to this over here. It still has the same colors, it still has that same atmosphere and that feel, but it's definitely heightened. It's more saturated, there's more of a contrast in values, how light to dark it is, and I like that a lot. But this leaf right here, I do want to simplify it a little bit because I don't want it to distract from the sunflower right here. So for that, I'm just going to take the highlight color that we have. I'm going to make a fairly watery mixture. And I'm going to work this on top of all of the darker greens that I have, progressively moving towards the tip. I'm starting up here at the area in which it would connect to the stem, because that's going to be the brightest area, it's closest to the light. And then as I get farther down, I start to lose pigment on my brush. It gets softer and softer, and that bottom might be a little bit darker, which isn't a bad thing. So that's going to help just relax that pigment a little bit. Here I'll grab a little bit more red, yellow, white. Go back, make sure those edges are nice and bright, nice and clean. When we do that, sometimes it can get a little bit messy. And I still want the back to be brighter, so here I'm just incorporating a little bit of extra highlight. It is taking out the detail on some of the spine of this, but I'm okay with that. It doesn't need to pop that dramatically. Again, I want it more dramatic than the photo, but all within reason. You can also add a bit more back in here. We'll just soften this a little bit. There we go. This little edge here, it's a little bit darker. It's almost as if it creases down. That way it has less light passes through it, but then the edge is still a little bit brighter, sharp, and crispy, which is nice. So we have a lot going on in that area. And I'm just applying a couple of these extra little applications to give it that detail that the side of it has. There we go. Now from there, I can tell I'm quite happy with this. I'm going to clean my brushes again, I'm going to clean my water again, then we're going to come back and we're going to paint our actual sunflower. So it's getting to the really exciting portion of the painting, which I think a lot of us wanted to start with, but again, it was important that we did the background and everything first. So let's do that, we'll come back and we'll paint a wonderful sunflower. So I am back, my brushes are clean, my water is clean, and that is imperative for this next step in the painting process because we're working with these yellows and they're so easily diluted and turned into green and other pigments, and we just want the best shot that we have at mixing them as well as we can. So with that, I'm going to begin here by taking my medium-sized flat-headed brush because again, it can cover a decent amount of space, but it's fairly detail-oriented and so are our petals. Now I'm going to try to mix a yellow that's fairly close to this. I want it to be a little bit brighter actually, just out of personal preference, but this would be a great thing to try to mix off of. So I'm going to begin by taking some of my cadmium yellow deep hue because this looks like a bit of a deeper pigment. Going to grab a hint of my primary red, just because it looks like it has a little bit of orange in it. Grab a little bit more, just like that. Grab some primary yellow, just a hint. And this is all very thin. Primary colors are innately incredibly thin. They're very transparent. You generally have to do a lot of layers of them. Titanium white, it's quite thick. You don't have to do as many layers, and adding it will thicken the pigment greatly. So I'll take a little bit of titanium white, not too much, and I'll work it in there. Make it fairly consistent. And now I'll try it up over here. And that is a slightly brighter version of what is currently on the reference photo, and that is what I want out of it. So this is great. I'm going to begin by just doing a very basic first layer for all of my petals, and I'm going to do them all in this pigment. Now it's imperative that, again, we start with our edges of our petals, and then later we go back in and we work in the middle. That way, when our paint is nice and clean and crisp and we can deliver all of these really nice lines, we do. And that way we don't have any toothy, unfinished, semi-transparent edges. I'm starting to run out of paint at this point, so now you know what? I'll jump back in to the middle area and I'll just fill this in. Nice and easy. Just like so. I'm really glad we brightened this a little bit. I feel like it would have been too dark had we went with that. But I'm glad we had it as a reference so we knew how dark or light we wanted it. Again, you don't have to follow a reference photo completely for it to be an incredibly useful tool. There we go. Now we'll keep doing a little bit more, starting with the edges. You can see how this brush and the size work really, really well. If you wanted it to be incredibly detailed and intricate, you could work with the smallest flat-headed brush, or if you wanted to speed this up a little bit, which I would understand, you could work with the larger flat-headed brush, but it would be more difficult to work in this detail. That said, you could definitely train yourself to work with it to do something like this. Now here I started to run out of paint, so I find myself just going back, painting these petals, and in the end I try to make the strokes for the petals in the same direction as the petal. That way, if some of the brush stroke shows through, it looks like it's leading the eye up or down the petal, which is great, rather than kind of through it. Now I just about ran out of paint, so I'll mix up some more. A lot of cadmium yellow, a little bit of primary yellow in there as well. Bit of primary red. Mix those up, and then we'll grab some extra titanium white. And I was just thinking about it, it's kind of amazing how we've been painting this sunset painting, all of these warm colors, but if you look at our palette, we didn't have any yellow really mixed until now. We had a little bit which we covered up over there, but it's amazing that we got to this point in the painting without having a lot of yellows here on the palette. I would innately think that this would just be full of them. And again, I think that's probably why my first version of this painting suffered as it did. I wasn't making the complex colors that I should have been. I actually wanted to release this lesson the previous week where I put up the version of the Earth, but it just didn't work out. So I figured I'd have some fun with the space painting again. I'd wanted to do one of those in the hour-long format for quite some time, so that was fun to do. But this is what I really wanted to do, especially because so many of you voted for it over on Patreon. I do want to say thank you for that. I do want to say thank you for supporting the channel in the way that you do. You honestly make these lessons happen. If it wasn't for you, it wouldn't be financially viable for me to make these throughout the week and put out these longer lessons. So it is because of you and your support that these lessons happen, and I am incredibly grateful for it. I am sure that all of the other people watching are also incredibly grateful to you for it as well. So thank you for making this. This lesson would not happen truly without you and your support. And I aim to thank you with that through things like polls and actually doing the lessons that you vote for. So that's why we're back doing this here today. Just making sure we get it done, and we do a great job at it. Sometimes that means I do have to paint a lesson 2 or 3 times, and that means that they don't get out as soon as I like, but then they're the best lessons they can be, and I think that's important. Coming along so well. Pops beautifully. Really like how these yellows complement all of the pinks and browns and oranges of the painting. Even fits in so well with the green. There we go. I like that a lot. Now, I went over the green right here, but as you can see, it's very transparent. You can see the green, and it isn't a nice clean line. So I'm just going to take a lot of thick pigment and just layer it on top right there. Took out a lot of that effect right there, and I'm going to do the same over here. Just clean that up. Here I'm going back over a couple of different areas, just making sure things are nice and thick where they need to be. And going over a couple of these same petals, as you can see in this direction. Making sure that if there are brush strokes, they are going in that proper movement as well. Now something else you can see is a little bit of a line that's around my flowers, and that's because when I initially drew this, I drew it a bit bigger and I tried to erase it, and that's something I like to note about the colored pencils that I use for the drawing. They erase fairly well. They don't erase perfectly, and sometimes you can still see it through. It just means we need to go back over it with a bit of a more thick layer, which we can do here with some cadmium yellow, primary red, titanium white, and primary yellow? Both yellows. I might make this a little bit darker because it's getting closer to the sunflower, so less light will pass through it. There we go. Definitely helping. I'm just blending it softly into the rest. As the petals move farther and farther away, they start to overlap each other less, and more light can pass through them because they become more thin. So this actually creates a very natural effect of depth and the light reacting to our painting. There we go. Then once I'm done applying that for the most part, I'm going back with those strokes that again stretch across the petals themselves. Just making sure there aren't hard edges or kind of horizontal strokes through them. There we are. Now I'm going to take a couple of steps back, just see how it looks with the rest of the painting, and then we can go from there. So immediately after stepping up, I can see there is a dramatic difference between this and this, and I actually, again, really like the brighter look to it. That said, we definitely need to add in some of this darker detail in there. So let's do that next. For that, I'm going to take my smallest flat-headed brush because it's so detail-oriented and there's a lot of detail in this next step. And I'm going to mix up a little bit of a darker orange here. So I'll take my burnt sienna, I'll mix that into what we have here. I'll grab a little bit of primary red, I'll mix that in. And it's going to create this more orangey, darker version, as you can see. Do want it to be orangey, so I'll grab some extra cadmium yellow deep hue. There we go. And then I'll grab a little bit of burnt umber as well to make it a bit earthy. And this will be the darker color that we have in here. So I'll test it here, and it's actually very, very close. And what this is going to do, it's going to make it look like there are petals overlapping. And when they're overlapping, light has to move through two of them at once. So it makes that area much darker than the areas where it only has to pass through once. There are also little spreading areas kind of in the back that kind of move out in all of these directions, as you can see here. And they're going to add to that as well. So what we can do, we can take a big petal to begin with, because it'll be an easy way to start. And I'm going to take this along the edge. I'm going to start moving it up a little bit. This will help us differentiate between some of the petals. And generally the edges will look a little bit darker as they have slight folds in them. And the light can't pass through the folds as well either. And then there are some creases in it. So I'll just throw a couple little creases into the edge there. And then I'll blend all of this from the bottom a little bit up, as you can see. And just like that, we have all of this extra detail in a petal. Now we can do that to this one right here. Starting on the edge, a soft blend up. Bottom's a little bit darker. Let's move to the next one. There we go. Going to make my brush fairly wet here, just because I want some nice soft blends happening. Like this. Turned out quite nice. There we go. That looks well. Get a little bit more burnt umber. You can change it a little bit as you go, just make it interesting. But if you do, make sure you work those new colors back into previously applied areas. That way it feels cohesive in the painting. You can also jump around from petal to petal in different areas of the flower, like this. And this will actually help the painting substantially as well, because a lot of us innately kind of simplify processes in our heads, and then it works its way into our brush stroke where we'll continuously do things the same way, and in the process of that, we'll simplify our painting, and it'll lose that interesting piece of it, that kind of more realistic effect. So what I want to do here is I kind of want to jump around. I'll still do my blends, I'll still work areas up as you can see, but I might go back and forth between a couple of them. That way I have to do things differently. My hand's changing the orientation. I'm probably changing the way my stroke is occurring slightly. And it's just going to make it so much more interesting in the long run. Here I'll add a little fold in this larger petal right here. Soften those blends on the edge. And I've done a fair amount here, so now I can step up and take a couple of steps back, see how it's going. So far, I like how it's going. It could be a little bit more dramatic. It's definitely much more dramatic here, but it's softer here because it's blending with the currently wet yellow that we have. So you know what? I'll take a little bit more of my burnt umber, my burnt sienna, my primary red, and then I will grab a bit more of this cadmium yellow deep hue. This time our mixture doesn't have the titanium white that it did before, so it'll be a bit darker. And I can test it in one of the darker areas of my previous petals, as you can see. Go over some of those previously darker areas, and now we have so much more contrast in it, and it really pops. Now, because it pops so much, we need to be a little bit more delicate and careful, because of course, if we do wrong to the painting, then it will be significantly more noticeable. So I'd actually recommend that you build up to this slowly. You start with some softer layers, some lighter layers, and then you work up to this more dramatic effect that we have going on right here. Here again, I'm still jumping around. That way we don't get too repetitive. Quickly running out of this new mixture, which is okay. Again, remixing your paint really shouldn't be a thing you fear. The more you do it, the better you'll get at it. And eventually, it'll just become a lot of fun because it'll be something where you go to do and you say, you know what, I can do this. I can kind of conquer this new mixture. I can have a lot of fun. I can play with it. I can try some new things. I can learn a lot. But I know that in the end, I can get what I want. And that only comes from practice. So again, if you want to get really, really good at mixing your colors, don't mix a lot of each color in your first mixture. Mix a little bit of it, then go back and force yourself to remix it again. And force yourself to remix it again. And eventually, you'll get great at just that. So again, I'm just about out. I'll grab some more burnt umber. I'll grab some more burnt sienna. Primary red. And then a good amount of cadmium yellow. There we go. Now I'm going to take off the paint that I had on my brush just because it was fairly globby, for lack of a better word. It really condensed at the end of the bristle there, and that's not what I want. Because when it does that, I can't apply a sharp, smooth stroke. So I take that extra paint off, and then I come back to the painting. Here I'll create some little folds in it, make it interesting. These highlights don't just happen along the edges and at the bottom. I said highlights. These shadows, these creases, don't just happen along the outsides and the bottom. They happen throughout the petal. It just so happens that the edges are generally, or the tips are generally a bit brighter because they don't overlap as much and because a little bit more light can work through them. There we go. Something I also like to do, you can see that this petal overlaps this petal, which overlaps this petal. That can quickly become a reoccurring element in the painting. And to make it a little bit more interesting, I like to switch it up occasionally. So here, I'll put this petal in front of this petal, and this petal is kind of in the back. So it kind of resets things. That way it isn't just continuously getting layered on top in the same way. This will make it more interesting. There we go. I made that quite dark, arguably darker than I want, so I just took off all the paint on my brush, made it very wet, And here, watch, we can strip off a lot of that paint. Make it more thin. By just adding a lot of water and then moving our finger on top. There we go. See? So don't worry about adding too much. As long as you are quick with taking it off, you can do that. I also switched fingers every time I applied them to take that paint off, because each time I do that, this finger will get a little bit of paint than this one, and I just want to keep doing this with clean fingers. There we go. Fixed. Going to jump again. Haven't done really any down here at the bottom, so I don't have a base layer of a semi-darker pigment, so I'm kind of just working with this singular darker pigment, and I'm trying to do a lot more blending than I was up here, because there we had multiple applications, which is again what I'd urge you to do, because hypothetically you have a little bit more time than I do, and it's a much safer way of going about it. I'm fairly confident I can make this all look quite good, doing this slightly more quick route of doing it, but again, if you're a beginner, then I don't recommend doing it all in this single application. Start with something that's a little bit brighter, and then build a slightly darker layer on top of it, then start with something lighter, then build a slightly darker layer on top of it, and just slowly build it up. You get a good understanding of the paint and how it blends that way. If you are more of a intermediate to advanced painter, then doing it in a single application, kind of as I am now, will work. That said, I think that this almost does look a little bit better than what we have down here. So it does just go to show that even if you are good at it, the extra layers will help. And I think I'll actually go back in and do some extra layering in these parts as well. There we go. Here I'm just prepping a couple of them while I have a lot of paint on my brush, and then as I start to run out of paint, I'm coming back in and I'm doing those blends. Turning out very well. I like this a lot. So from there, I'm going to just add a little bit more right here. Now I'll take a couple of steps back and see how it's progressing. So at this point, I'm really liking it. I do much prefer this brighter look than that right there. That said, if you're doing this brighter look and you want to make it a little bit darker, you can just glaze a little bit of a darker orangey red on top of it, like you could do to the rest of the painting to make it a little bit more like that. But at this point, I'm really happy. I do want to darken some of these edges, and to do that, I'm really going to want to go in with some thin layers of darker pigment, maybe even a little bit of Mars Black. But for that to happen, because I want it to be so wet, because I want such thin layers, I need this to dry entirely, otherwise I'll just be moving around all of that darker paint that I just applied. So I'm going to wait 10-15 minutes, maybe have a little bit of lunch, let that dry, clean my brushes, clean that, and then I'll get back to it. But at this point, I'm also going to remove my reference photo, because I want to really be able to look at the painting by itself and not visually have this contrast. I want to be able to finish this painting as this painting. I might use it a little bit for the detail in there and getting that color, but I don't want to obstruct my view. I don't want to dilute my view with another thing, and I know that might sound crazy, but it's kind of like when you have been painting for a while and you have a lot of paintings up on your wall and you want to do something different, or you want to do something that's a little more you almost have to remove all of the other pieces to start again fresh and to get it the way you want. And I'm kind of doing this with a similar effect. The reference photo, it got me really far. It got me all of these great complex colors that I love, but at this point, I don't want that visual confusion. So I'm removing that for the most part, and we're going to continue working on this with some darker areas. That said, I feel like I need to play the advocate as well. Following the reference photo through to the very end can be a great thing for some people. I think it's very much a creative personality type thing, and I encourage you to work however you feel works best for you, regardless of what I may say or another teacher of art might say. Art is incredibly subjective. It isn't necessarily about right or wrong. It is about what you like and what works for you, and it's imperative that you keep that in mind and make what you love and work in the process that you love as well. I am here to give you ideas, to show you how different things can be done, not to tell you how things should be done. So, with that, I'm going to take a little bit of a break, and we'll be right back. So, we are now back. I have my clean water, I have my clean brushes, this is entirely dry, and we can continue darkening those edges. So, I'm going to take my smaller, flat-headed brush, make sure that it's nice and damp. And now I'm going to grab a hint, and I do mean a hint of Mars Black. I don't want much of it at all. I'm going to mix it fairly closely to our previous pigment. That way I know how close we are to it, but I'm not going too dark. I'm going to grab some burnt sienna, move those two together, and I'll also grab a hint of titanium white as well to thicken it and to make it a little bit brighter. So I'll try that to begin with. I think that's a nice mixture right there. It's a little bit earthy, which is what we want. And I'll start at the bottom, along the edges. I have a good amount of paint on my brush right now, so I'm kind of just moving it out in all of these different directions as I move around my petals. You can see it's much more visually definitive. There's less of a blend, but it's still that earthy, warm tone. So it's cohesive. Now, before it all starts to dry, I'll go back in, I'll add a hint of it to some of the backs and bottoms, like that. Make sure my brush is nice and damp, and now I'll go back in and I'll do those blends that we were working on before. There we go. You can see it's so much more stark now. And just working it around the edges in the very least is a nice effect. You don't even have to do it so much at the back if you don't want this darker blend. The edges in the very least will give you a very clean looking, stark application. Starting to run out of water on my brush, so I'm just hopping back into that water. Starting to dry a little bit, so I have to apply some extra pressure, move it around a little bit more than I would have. It's okay though. That's why we didn't do the whole flower this way first. Wanted to make sure that I could get back to this before it started to fully dry. You can see how quickly we're applying all of it, but it adds such a nice, almost final touch to these petals. That worked really well. So it's nice that we get to continue to incorporate this darker earthy tone that we had in the outskirts of the painting and kind of re-incorporate it in the main most visually charged area of the painting. Here I'm just mixing up a little bit more of our pigment. Added a hint of red into it this time. Yet again, I'm applying it and I feel like I have a lot of paint here on my brush. So I'm just doing the edges first, and then I'll go back in and I'll do a blend. I'll probably get to that blend a little bit more quickly than I did last time, just because I found it was a little bit difficult to work with last time. I think I waited slightly longer than I should have. But that's okay, we were able to fix it. And now we know a better time frame to work with. There we go. So going back to the water, making it nice and wet, I'll start with the ones that I believe I did first because they are closest to drying. Making the inside a little bit darker with some of them. I'm occasionally bringing this out to the tip of the flower, which could be darker, as maybe it kind of folds back in and that lip creates this area in which the light can't pass through as easily. There we go. Significantly more dramatic. Now I'm kind of bouncing around as we do, finding some different areas. Adding some detail where it might be a little bit void of it. I essentially outlined the entirety of this petal right here, and you can see that it's a little bit stark, but I do like that. I think that once in a while it's a nice touch. I'm just moving around that paint a little bit so it's less thick around the tip, and then it gets more thick as it gets towards the heart of the petal. Here, going over a couple areas again, darkening things. I think I want a little bit more Mars Black in my mixture. Pigment's starting to dry a little bit here on my palette, which is okay. We can always get a little bit more, but it's important to recognize that so that you're not starting to kind of get lazy and saying, oh, you know what, that's okay, I'll just grab more of this pigment or this pigment. If you don't have enough of the pigment you need, you should add more of it to your palette and then continue from there. There we go. And I kind of feel like this area got a little bit too dark too quickly, so I'll take some of that cadmium yellow deep hue, a little bit of our burnt sienna, a little bit of titanium white, create something similar to what we had for the actual petal initially. And I'll blend that in a little bit here. It's a little bit darker, so I'm using it more kind of at the bottom area of these, which is nice. But now we can lighten it, take some extra primary yellow and titanium white, mix those together, and brighten it back up again. As you can see, it's a little bit less saturated because we had so much titanium white, but that's okay. We can reincorporate that saturation by just taking our yellow, or two yellows in this case, blending them together, and then working them back in there. Needs to be a bit more red, so take a little bit of that red. And this is just to show you that you can continuously course correct until you get what you actually want. I think this is quite larger than I want, and I kind of want to taper it. So I'm going to move this petal on top of it, which will be difficult because it's such a dark pigment. We'll need to do a couple of layers here, but I'm confident in our ability to get it done. Added a lot of titanium white to make it nice and thick. As you can see, it worked, it overlapped it well. However, it now doesn't have as much saturation because of all of that titanium white. So take some extra cadmium yellow deep hue, work that in. It's much more saturated now, needs a bit of red. Just add a hint of that at the edge. And then I'll blend that this way. And now I will redefine that darker line with burnt umber, burnt sienna, Mars black, hint of titanium white. And there we go. Just like that, we have it fixed. Now, I'm quite a fan of what we have here. I'm probably going to want to go back and touch up a couple little areas, but from here, I think we can move on to this middle area. And for this, I'm going to take my reference photo yet again, because I've moved the canvas over, I don't have as much space for this anymore. But what I'll do, I'll put it right down here, the way I can mix and blend with it, should I need to. I'm going to switch to my medium-sized flat-headed brush. It is 1 centimeter wide. I'm going to mix up a pigment that's fairly similar to that or fairly similar to this. So I'll start with some Mars black, grab some burnt umber, grab some burnt sienna, grab a hint of titanium white, hint of primary blue, hint of primary red. And now I'll work this along the edge. This brush has a very sharp edge, so it'll be quite good for defining this. As our subjects get closer and closer into the foreground, we generally want them to appear sharper and sharper, and this is great to do that. Now I know creating a relatively perfect circle is quite difficult. It doesn't need to be absolutely perfect, but if you want it to be, you can use the reference photo, the traceable, because it is a perfect circle. You can also trace around a mug or something you might find in the kitchen. That generally works. It might be difficult to find something the exact size you need, but it's an option. Here I'm just filling it in as I start to run out of paint. Need to go back, grab some more. Using the corner for the really detailed areas. And filling it out like that. Which is great. Leads us on to the next part of our painting, which is all of the little details that are in there. So you could do this by waiting for that to dry and then working on top of it, which can be easier because it means it won't blend with that. But I think I want it to be a little bit more subtle. I want a bit of a blend in there. So I'm going to wet work while that's still wet. I'm going to take the smallest flat-headed brush and I'm going to use the corner of it to create these little markings and dots. And I'm going to mix something similar to that. So let's start with some primary red. Grab some cadmium yellow deep hue, a little bit of burnt sienna. Again, I'm doing this intuitively to begin, and then I'll test, see how close it is, what I need to do to it. I think it needs to be more red and burnt sienna based, but I do have a bit of yellow working in there as well. Now I'll take this, kind of tap it on. It's a bit brighter, and on this it's a bit more pink. So much like the rest of the painting is a little bit more pink, I'll do that. And I want it to be a bit brighter because I'm mixing into this dark pigment rather than just working on top of it. So I'm going to take the corner now, and I'm going to make all of these little strokes. I'm starting on the very edge and I'm moving my way in a little bit. It's kind of a tap and a drag effect. And I'm doing this all the way around the outskirts. And I'm not making the smallest implication that I can, but I'm making a relatively small implication. And as we move closer into the flower, I'll start making it slightly smaller. Now, as you can see, as I continue, it progressively gets less and less noticeable because, of course, we're running out of paint. So it's important that we continuously go back, grab more. Here I just continue to work around, and it's significantly darker than what I have on the palette because it is still wet with that almost black pigment, but that's exactly what I wanted. So it's all working well. It's important to recognize that the pigment you apply to the painting isn't always going to be exactly what you have on your palette, especially if the layer that you're working on top of is wet, but also in cases where the layer that you're working on top of is dark. This is both. So it's going to change the pigment that we have on our palette dramatically. So we want to mix, not to make the perfect color, but to make the color that will work really well when it mixes and blends with what we have on our palette, because it's inevitable and we know it'll happen. So we work with it rather than ignoring it. I go back over some areas a couple of times and I just keep tapping it on like this, as you can see. That said, I think I need to take a little water break, so I'm going to put this down, grab a drink of water, and then I will be right back. So I am back, and this is still a little bit wet / damp, so I can kind of just continue applying these on. That said, if it does dry entirely as you are moving through it and you don't finish as quickly as you'd like, you can incorporate more water into your mixture, and that'll help you get more of a transparent effect. You can also press a little bit harder with your brush, as that will thin the paint more. However, it will make your application slightly larger, so I would probably go with the route of adding more water to your mixture. And another thing you can do is kind of take a lot of paint here, wipe it off on this, and then just use the excess paint that you have on your brush. It'll be much more minimal, and it won't create that big of an effect. Now here, I'm actually just using the corner of my brush and I'm going back over previously applied areas and just thickening that pigment in areas where it might have been a little bit too blended, too thin. And then once I start to run out of paint, I'm moving back in towards the center and I'm just doing this little tap motion. I'm not doing much of a tap and drag like I was doing on the edges because I just don't need to create a large implication like I was doing before. It's much smaller, it's much more minimal, there isn't movement, and it's just going to make this a lot easier. There we go. See that? Turning out great. Takes a little bit because we need to make a lot of strokes, but once we get them, it's a really nice, neat effect. Here you can see we're just going back, covering up some areas again. There we go. Slowly just adding to it. And as you can see, it's not a perfect application all the way around. I wanted this area to be a little bit darker because I wanted there to be something interesting happening. I wanted there to be a little bit more depth. I wanted it to be in effect like it's moving a little bit. So with that, we get all of that extra detail. I'm very happy with that application. Next, I'm going to take a little bit of my primary yellow, move that to a new area of my palette, a little bit of my cadmium yellow deep hue, a good amount of my titanium white. I'm going to mix up a much brighter yellow than what we've used in our painting. As you can see, wipe off the excess. And I'm just going to add a little bit of this into the brighter areas of our petals. And that's generally going to be more in the middle to the ends. As you can see. It's a little bit less saturated because it has a lot of titanium white in it. But it's nice and bright, pops a little bit, it gives it this added dimension. And I'm blending it into our previous applications to a point. I want it to be relatively subtle. So I'm not just throwing it on and leaving all of these hard edges. I am going back with a little bit of a tap, a little bit of a drag, and softening it. I want to use a good amount of titanium white, but I don't want to use so much that it becomes this pigment right here, because if it does, then it won't really stand out well. So this is about as bright as I'm willing to go, and I think I'm going to darken it a little bit with a bit more cadmium yellow deep hue. Much better. And we'll just fill this in a couple of areas. Going to go back to this, kind of soften it, bring it out, make it cohesive. This is a petal we had a fair number of issues with, so we can go back and rework it a little bit. Kind of nice when I look back on this, that's the only real petal I think of as an issue petal. So it just speaks to how consistent the technique is if at the end you say, you know what, there was one little problem area in a mixture of maybe 30 petals. There we go. Nice little pop of color. I think we'll add a bit more up here, just because I feel like the bottom's a little bit brighter. Using a lot more titanium white. There we go. Lots of layering, it's all paying off. Quite nice. I think I might grab a little bit more of this middle color again, or mix up a little bit more. So cadmium red, burnt sienna, a little bit of burnt umber, good bit of titanium white, hint of cadmium yellow deep hue. This is a bit brighter, which is good. And I'll just heighten these little pieces along the edge a little bit more, just as a little bit of a touch-up. As we brightened the petals, it made this look a little bit more subdued. So just to make sure things remained balanced in the painting, figured we'd go back, we'd add a little bit more of a highlight into here, and just make sure it's all progressing as it's meant to. There we go. That's quite nice. Now, I occasionally made a couple of them a little bit too big, so I'm just going to take a very watery brush, move that out. And do the same here. Now I'll take a couple of steps back, see how it's turning. So far so good. I think we just need to continue doing a couple little touch-ups, but we are definitely moving along really well here in the painting. I want to make this side a little bit brighter, not too much. I still want this part to be a bit darker, but I'm just going to do these little taps at the corner. Remember that the edges are more of a tap and a drag to make it a bit bigger. Then as we get more into the middle, it's more of just a tap. And if you want it to be more transparent, just grab more water. There we go. Much better. Now from there, this is very saturated and very stark. This right here, it almost blends in light-wise with the background, and I want to make something that's a little bit more stark. So I'm just going to switch over to the smaller round-headed brush. Remember, this has a soft head, it won't create any real streaks, and I'm just going to create a darker green. So I'll begin by making sure that it's nice and damp. As so, I'll grab some of our cadmium yellow deep hue, mix up a nice dark green. I'll grab a little bit of Mars black, really darken it, get a little bit more cadmium yellow deep hue, work back and forth here. I'll apply it around the middle and the back of my stem, bring it up in behind this leaf here, leaving the edges to be brighter. And then I'm going back in a little bit of a circular motion. I'm softening those edges, making sure that it doesn't look like a hard stroke. But for the most part, it should look soft because we are using the round-headed brush. Now I'm going to want a bit more of it. Work it into the back of this leaf. Progressively work it forward. Allow it to dissipate as we get towards the front. And then I'll do the same with the other side as well. There we go. I'll mix up just a hint more. Like so. Go over a couple areas that might be a little bit thin in that first application. A little bit watery. That way things are consistent. We don't want to get lazy now. There we go. It's definitely more saturated than it was. Pops a little bit more. I also want to go back in and highlight the edges here a little bit more. So grab more of that pinky yellow that we had. My water has a little bit of blue in it right now, so I need to be careful. If you find that you're getting hints of green, immediately stop, clean your water, clean your brushes, and then come back to it. I don't seem to, so I'm going to progress. Just going to add a little bit more of this golden pink color to the back here. Have it lean in a little bit. Or just saturating things to match the flower. There we go. Again, I'm going to take a couple of steps back. Now, I really like how it's turning out. I like the leaf, I like the petals. What I do feel like we could add on now, because we've saturated these a little bit more than we did in the reference photo. So this background, which we created from the reference photo, now looks quite subtle and could be heightened slightly. So I'm going to show you how to do that without going back and repainting this. For this next step, you'll need completely clean water and completely clean brushes. It is 100% necessary, otherwise things will get diluted very quickly. And for this next and final step, we're just going to do a little bit of a glaze. We talked about it a couple times in the lesson, and what a glaze is when you take an incredibly thin layer of paint, apply it over a previously applied, fully dry, thick layer of paint, and you just add a wash of color on top. You don't disturb the values, the contrast, any of that, you just add a hint of color. So for that, we're going to take the larger flat-headed brush because it can cover a large surface area. I'm going to make sure that the tip of it is nice and damp. I'm going to create kind of an orange for the edge here, a pinkish orange. So I'll take some of my primary red, I'll take a bit of my cadmium yellow deep hue, I'll blend those two together. I'll grab a good bit of titanium white, create this pinkish orange as you can see, and then I'm going to make it incredibly thin by taking a lot of water, moving it on top of this. As you can see, it's more like watercolor than acrylic at this point. And then I can apply it like this. And here you can see all of that water just moving around. I'm going to apply it to the top left and top right hand corner. And then I'm just going to move it inwards. And it looks like it's blending with the paint underneath, but it can't be because that paint underneath is fully dry, right? You're right. It's just moving on top. But because it's so thin, it looks like it's blending. We have the most amount of paint over here, so it's the most stark over there. But then as we move farther and farther away, we start to lose that paint. It gets more thin. And so it looks like it's blending into a previous layer. It's a really nice, easy trick to add a little bit of color at the end of your painting. There we go. Though it is entirely necessary for you to have an entirely clean brush, entirely clean water, and the paint that you are applying this on top of must also be completely dry. So there are a couple rules if you want a clean application, but there aren't too many, and it can be really nice for the painting. I'm leaving the bottom to be quite bright. That way it looks like the sunset is happening. It's making that area just so much brighter. Top of the sky and the corners are a little bit darker because, of course, we're getting farther and farther away from that light. Can even go over my petals a little bit too. Just be careful because they are yellow and quite bright. I'm going to take a couple steps back, see how that's looking. Like it a lot so far. Just going to soften this a little bit more. Trying to create more of a shallow arch rather than a high one right now. So I'm just moving around that incredibly wet paint. There we go. It's really nice. But anyways, there we have it. That is today's hour-long painting lesson. Yet again, it's probably closer to 2 hours, but it was a lot of fun. I'm really glad we got back to this. I just finished all of those digital sketches for Patreon, and I don't know, I felt the need to paint one, and I'm really glad that you voted for it. So thank you for making this happen. This was a great time. I hope that you are incredibly pleased with your piece and with all of the new little things that you learned here in today's tutorial. As you know, I do post these lessons every Saturday for free up here on YouTube, so I will see you next Saturday with a brand new lesson. I also intend on uploading a new bonus lesson up on Patreon quite soon, so look out for that. I also think I'm going to do a new poll soon in regards to the next set of paintings, so look for that too. A lot of fun things happening, and I thank you for sharing them all with me. I will see you very soon with a brand new hour-long painting lesson, and above all, as always, stay creative.